Bob Herbert's op-ed.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to op-ed.tv. We claim to be living in a democracy, more accurately, a democratic republic. But does that have any meaning when George W. Bush and Donald Trump can get elected president despite losing the popular vote? Or when the Republican Party, while screaming hypocritically about voter fraud, has been rigging the election system for years to give itself wholesale advantages in national, state, and local governments, despite being consistently outpolled by Democrats. Or when voters favor stronger gun control measures, easier access to legal abortions, a higher minimum wage, and many other measures that they have been unable to achieve no matter how often they go to the polls and cast a ballot. Two prominent political scientists, Martin Gilens of Princeton and Benjamin I. Page of Northwestern, studied these issues and were blunt in summarizing their findings. They said, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. What kind of democracy is that? I'll talk about all of this with a very special guest, Eric Alterman. He's an historian, journalist, author, professor, and the former longtime media columnist for The Nation magazine. Eric, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here, as always.
On top of everything I mentioned in the intro, we've also had to live through the January 6th insurrection and its aftermath. So my first question is a broad one. How would you describe the state or condition of democracy in America today?
I'd say hanging by a thread. You bring up our system of government as a democratic republic, and you have to keep in mind two things. One is that the people who drew it up were extremely nervous and suspicious of democracy itself, and we're not interested in making the democratic polis very powerful. They were much more comfortable with elite rule. And second, that document was written a long time ago. It was approved in 1789. A lot has happened since then, and a lot of ways to manipulate its structures have arisen. And there's a movement almost entirely on the right that says, well, we can't have any laws that were not imagined at the time by the founders. And that's obviously ridiculous. My former professor at Stanford, Jack Rakoff, who's one of the leading experts on the writing of the Constitution, has written a lot about how crazy it is to look to the founders to decide what we should be doing many hundreds of years later on the basis of what they knew at the time. So the result has been that nefarious people for bad purposes have been able to manipulate these structures in order to water down whatever democratic content our system has. It grew more democratic over time, of course, as the Supreme Court loosened its notion of what was in that document. But in recent times, as the Republican Party has become more and more radicalized, less and less committed to democracy, more and more committed to winning at any cost, regardless of the rules or even democracy itself, well, it's not working very well. And given how bad things got under Donald Trump, how close we came to a coup on January 6th and the events leading up to January 6th, and the events since then, and the lies that have been fed to so many people, one would have to guess that it will not survive necessarily the next 3 years. That I've been betting against it. Things are looking really bad. It's really a time of crisis.
I agree that things are looking really bad. Had come to a similar conclusion and was hoping that perhaps you would tell me that I was incorrect. But matters are, in fact, pretty dire. And we've been brought to this moment by Donald Trump and his administration. But obviously, and as you've been pointing out, this did not start with Donald Trump. The radicalization of the Republican Party started some time ago. Could you try and trace that arc a little bit?
Well, there's always been a radical element to the Republican Party and a violent element to the Republican Party, the modern Republican Party. You can point to it in the Goldwater campaign of 1964. There have been a number of changes since then, and it would take a long time to go through all of them, but I'll give you the top five, let's say. Number one is that the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act put all Southern conservatives, took them out of the Democratic Party and put them into the Republican Party, and made race a fundamental part of its appeal. So racists, people whose primary goal in life was to retain white supremacy, who by and large became Republicans and not Democrats. They had been Democrats since the Civil War. Number two, the Republicans created an entire media and intellectual structure to support their views, even though they had no academic respectability. They created news services, the most obvious one being Fox News, but there are many of them, and think tanks that have all of they're sort of kabuki think tanks. They have all of the pretenses of universities, but what they publish is propaganda to support their side. And the third thing is that the media, the mainstream media, decided that it was not in the business of truth anymore. It was in the business of giving, quote unquote, both sides a fair hearing and letting the viewer or the reader or the listener decide for themselves what was true. Now, this was always been the case since objectivity became the goal of the news media in the 1930s and 40s, pioneered by the New York Times. But the Republicans, taking a page from Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s, figured out that they could lie, and they could lie all they wanted, and that the media was not going to call them on it, that they could make up things about first, it became most obvious, I'd say, under Bill Clinton, and then when Newt Gingrich came to lead the Republican Party. He's a pathological liar. And even stronger under a Barack Obama, where you could not even get a Republican leader on television to admit that Barack Obama had been born in this country or was not a Muslim. And the media would not clarify this. They would say, well, you decide, here's the evidence. So the Republicans took this further and further, and the media, together with Republican leadership, created this Frankenstein monster. I will not make the mistake of calling Frankenstein monster Frankenstein, because that was the name of the scientist, as we all know, but created this Frankenstein monster, which is the Trump movement. It's not Donald Trump himself. Donald Trump, as we New Yorkers all know, is a clown. He's not someone anyone would take seriously. He can be entertaining if he doesn't have any power. But they created this man who got to the top by lying, by cheating, by refusing to play by any rules itself, by refusing to admit when he was beaten or wrong. And somehow his entire party and 72 million, 74 million, I forget which, voters are going along with it. And the reason is, Bob, is that they're not really invested in democracy itself. They're invested in their side winning. They're invested in the hatred of people like you and me, and most of the viewers of our show right now. And beating us is more important to them than A, living in a democracy, and B, having a political system that works for them.
Yeah, and the attacks on the media have only been intensified. There's a lawsuit against the New York Times by Sarah Palin. I guess it's a defamation suit. What made me think about that was the term pathological liar, which is hyperbole, which is like normal, or has been for a long time, normal journalism. But these days, hyperbole doesn't fly. It used to be that you could take, you had more freedom to talk about public figures, and we still do, but they're trying to erode that. So we're in a very dangerous moment in many aspects of our so-called democracy. We're in real trouble in media, in laws, in terms of the Supreme Court, and in terms of my next question, voting rights. The Republicans have like this unbelievable attack underway on voting rights, and I'd like you to talk about that for a few minutes, if you could. What are some of the most serious elements of what the Republicans have been trying to do, and in some cases succeeding, and when it comes to the erosion of voting rights in this country?
Well, again, there's an awful lot to say about this. Number one is that they are reversing the legal gains that were made in the wake of the Voting Rights Act of the 1960s. And Republicans, many of whom supported that act and have supported its renewal over the years, have now been forced to turn against it, or they will lose. They will be primaried and they will lose their entire careers. So there's no longer support in the abstract for the right to vote. And the reason for that is because when people are allowed to vote, they tend not to vote for Republicans. Only one Republican has won a popular election out of the past six, and
presidential election.
Presidential in the past six presidential, and there's no chance. And both in the Senate and the House, vastly more people vote for Democrats than vote for Republicans, even though until recently there were far more Republicans in both in the Senate and sometimes in the House. We're getting to a point, because of the system that was created by the founders from way back, where 30% of the country will elect 70% of our electors, and vice versa. And by the way, one thing I neglected to mention was the packing of the Supreme Court by Republicans, and particularly under Donald Trump. So,
and even before that, the unwillingness to seat Merrick Garland.
Well, that's part of what I meant by the packing, yeah. And by the way, if there's one thing that John Roberts has been consistently dedicated to, it's taking away voting rights.
Absolutely, virtually his entire career.
Yeah. So that's one part of it. A second part of it is trying to make voting harder in places where poor people and people of color need to vote. So people who only have to take off a little time to vote have to wait on really long lines. There's absolutely crazy laws that should insult our intelligence and our sense of morality, that you can't give people water in some of these states while they wait on long lines. I mean, that should shock any Christian, I would think. But that's who's passing the law.
Yeah, they've made that, making that a crime to hand a bottle of water to someone who's standing in a long line on a hot day, waiting for hours to vote.
There are also some laws about to be passed or passed, I can't answer that question, that make it a crime to drive someone to vote in certain places. On top of that, the Republican Party, at Trump's behest, is replacing all of the people who insisted on a fair count of the vote in places where it was close, where he thought he might win, with people who will lie about the vote, who will take away the vote, who will give out false information. And also, laws are being passed that will allow Republican state legislatures in the future just to ignore the vote and send whatever electors they wish to the Electoral College, rather than the ones that are elected in there.
Which is a story I think has really been underplayed so egregiously. It's really upsetting to me. They're passing laws that would make it possible to overturn the results of a legitimate election.
Right. So when you add up all these things, and the fact that the court is always, the Republicans appointed on the court always side with the Republicans on this, it's hard to imagine how there can be a fair presidential election or election of Congress. And I haven't even mentioned, what's the word? Gerrymandering. Haven't mentioned gerrymandering.
Gerrymandering, yeah.
Right.
Extreme gerrymandering.
Extreme gerrymandering. So, so the upshot is that it's really hard to look at the system we have and call it democratic. I mean, you're right not to call us a democracy in the first place. We're not a democracy. We're a democratic republic. But there's very little democracy in that democratic republic. The question
Right.
for me is, how far towards fascism are we likely to go under this new system? Because what will be the guardrails on a president like Trump, who was really, a thug? It's not.
Right.
I'm not exaggerating. I'm not
Right.
using unfriendly language. Everything about his career demonstrates this. I mean, the way he ran his business, the way he treats women, the way he speaks
Which is the
about
way he
minorities.
should have been portrayed all along.
Exactly. And he was, by the way. You can read it I mean, I wrote it. Jane Mayer wrote it in the New Yorker. You can find it in a lot of places. The political system chose to ignore it.
Right.
The fact that Trump told 30,000 lies, I think it was, as president, it shouldn't have surprised anyone. The surprise was that it took so long for people to admit that they were lies. That it took almost a year for the New York Times to put the word lie in the headline. So my particular hobby horse is the unwillingness of the media. This is what I write about virtually every week in the American Prospect, in my quote unquote altercation newsletter that goes out every Friday. You can sign up for it, you get it for free. Is the way that the media treats both sides as somehow equivalent. That
Right.
The side that is trying to protect voting rights, that the side that is trying to get the truth out there about what is happening, the side that is interested in preserving democracy is treated as having no more legitimacy, no more importance, and no more validity than the side that is trying to destroy all these things. And a lot of times reporters will say, well, if you read the whole article, you'll see that I was ultimately telling you that the Republicans are not telling the entire truth. The word falsehood is somewhere in there. But the fact is that fewer than 5% of articles actually get read these days because of social media. People only see the headlines. And the headlines are always impossible to tell what's really going on, because they're treated as one side says this and one side says that. Or they're written in the passive voice, as if nobody is the one
Right.
taking away the voting rights or so forth. And when you add that up to the conservative media, which is as committed to lies as the Trump Republicans are, and social media, where the right has been much more effective than the left in dominating those platforms, then there's very little. You have to work really hard to get the truth and find out what's going on. You have to spend a lot of time on it. And I do it for a living, so I can do it. But most people have jobs and lives and are dealing with a virus and other, struggles at the moment. And they don't have time, and they're an easy mark for these liars. And that's one explanation as to why 74 million or so people would support Trump, given all we know. But those lies have grown stronger since the election, and they're growing stronger every day. I mean, the idea, I'm sure you remember, and the viewers remember watching January 6th and being horrified that such a thing was possible in this country. It looked like, it reminded me of Night of the Living Dead, that movie I saw in college.
I agree.
And yet now it's treated as something to be debated over, something, well, maybe they were just excited people on vacation. Really, what's so wrong with it? Why are we persecuting these patriots? And
it's now just one more thing that happened over the past 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and so will, I suppose, the destruction of our democracy. I mean, there's two sides to that. Maybe it's a good thing, maybe whatever. But the fact is that there's no question that the mainstream media have decided it's not their business to defend the democracy that, by the way, protects their right to be in the media under the First Amendment. What they are responsible in their minds is to power. And there's power on one side and there's power on the other side. And again, the right is much better than the left at pressuring the mainstream media, working the refs, I call it. And that's what they respond to. I know journalists will tell me, I would like to get hassled more on the left, but I don't. I only get hassled by the right. And that's where our mistakes look bad, because they're so trumpeted throughout social media. So that's where I have to be careful. And that's why I have to use kid gloves and be extra nice.
You've talked about how broad media have become in this day and age. And one of the things that I've been concerned about, we're witnessing, you and I guess both believe, that we're witnessing the destruction of the democratic aspects of our society. I think that we're also witnessing the destruction of the press as we've known it, and that's been institutionally one of the tremendously important guardrails of democracy. And my question is, have media proliferated to such an extent so that everyone is a pundit or a thought leader or other weird terms that are out there? Have they proliferated so widely that there's no way to establish real standards and values anymore when it comes to journalism in a broad sense?
That's a good question. My very first book, published in 1992, was called Sound and Fury: The Making of the Punditocracy. A word I'm proud to have coined and is now in the Oxford English Dictionary. It'll be in my, I hope it'll be in my obituary one day. And when I published that book in 1992, I identified about 24 tops, people who made up the punditocracy, whose opinions mattered. These were gatekeepers. I don't want to sell them as being too wonderful. They weren't. They were a very narrow group of people with a narrow group of interests. They didn't understand that their lives were in many ways disconnected from those of most Americans. But up until that point, they had felt a certain sense of responsibility to speak for others, to speak for the larger picture. I think the first thing that corrupted this was the birth of talk radio, which arose in response to the mainstream media and attacked it, and that was entirely a right-wing phenomenon. Rush Limbaugh was making a fortune, and then that migrated to television. Originally, the TV guys, their biggest weakness was that they played Scott characters. Like I compared one to Fred Mertz and one to Ward Cleaver, and they were a little bit silly, but eventually they saw all the money and all the attention that was being garnered on talk radio, as did the producers and the owners of these networks, and so they brought in people like that. That's where the whole Fox News, Bill O'Reilly and Hugh Hewitt and what's his face, also they all came from talk radio, and they brought these values where it's a matter of screaming at the guy, and it's also a matter of screaming at the congressmen who don't play a law. So an important step on this road to Damascus, such as it is for the Republican Party becoming a pro-fascist party, was its need to show its fealty to Fox News and to talk radio. Because if they did anything that got anyone upset, they would be barraged by callers that were inspired by these people and taken to task. This worked even in the Clinton and the Obama administration on occasion. So as these crazy people got more and more outrageous, and today the most egregious example would be Tucker Carlson, who used to be a perfectly sane, decent person. I used to have lunch with him on occasion. I used to debate him in public.
Watch that transformation has, I think, really been stunning. The Tucker Carlson who was and the Tucker Carlson who became what he is now.
Tucker Carlson was hired by both PBS and MSNBC. Nobody could get along without Tucker Carlson for a while because he was a reasonable conservative. So now he's way out there in anti-vax land, in racism land, in anti-immigrant land. Yeah. I personally think he's running for president. I think he's a better Trump than Trump would be for a lot of reasons. And he's already got, he's got a direct line to his audience and people, and he's very, there are a lot of reasons Tucker could run a credible campaign. And he's got this side of him that appears reasonable. So I find he makes me very nervous in a way that these crazy frothing Republicans like Ted Cruz, not as much. But anyway, the weird relationship between Fox News and talk radio and the Republican Party, people talk about these things as if they're different things, but they're not. It's like a Borg. If you look at the Trump administration, like there was like a subway train, a shuttle train, Times Square to Grand Central, back and forth with staff so that you didn't know which you were working for, Fox News or the White House Communications Office, and it didn't matter. At one point, the director of the White House communications staff was being paid at the same time by Fox News. And by the way, the reason he had to leave Fox News was a sexual predation problem that appeared to affect almost everyone at Fox News. So the real problem is that Fox News is treated as news when it's never been news. It's a propaganda station that has no commitment whatsoever to truth.
Yeah, we're going to have to leave it there because we've run out of time, but there's so much more to talk about. So I hope we can have you back again very soon. We've been talking with Eric Alterman and Eric, thank you so much.
Thank you.
To our viewers, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.